Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the YLP Hockey PodKass. I'm your host, Josh Cass, and we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. For nearly 20 years, you've entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids, and now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease, and he'll do it with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, please reach out to the Weiselberg Law Real Estate Services today. You can call 917-952-2597 or send them an email. Just email wiselawesc@gmail.com. And I want to remind everyone once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. So we're back with another episode. There have been some obstacles in the way, but I'm hoping that now we really can just keep going and no more blockades. It's a clear path, and we are going to really have a lot coming at you guys. The first episode of the season that I made was about the JV League, a bit of a rundown, a breakdown, maybe some playoff predictions were involved. Not maybe, they were. But with that being said, today's episode is pretty much that, but all about varsity, except it's going to be more of an abbreviated version, more of a modified version because of the fact that varsity, we usually get previews to varsity leagues when those teams are in JV, or I think it's fair to say it like that. So with that being said, today is going to be about varsity, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened so far. We're going to talk a little bit about the recent and past occurrences. And we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the expectations or maybe some of the trends that may continue, may not continue going forward. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the playoff picture. I'm not going to be making playoff predictions, not hard on playoff predictions at least, but similar to what I did in JV, where I at least broke down the way that teams, are decided for the playoff seeding, and the number of teams that make it, how it lays out, stuff like that. That is going to be what this episode is all about. So let's get right into it. First thing that I am going to do is just break down the standings real quick. I don't have time to say all of the records, but just to let you guys know sort of where the expectations have been so far for certain teams and if they stand in areas, and that's what we'll do to start. So we'll start with the Eastern Conference in the 1 through 5 spots. I'm going to do this by groups. We have DRS in first, Hafter in second, North Shore in third, YDE in fourth, and Hank in fifth. And then the bottom 4 teams, there are 9 teams in the Eastern Conference as of now in the East Division, are Flatbush is in sixth, Rambam is in seventh, Solomon Schechter is in eighth, Magen David is in ninth. In the Western Conference at the moment, we have TABC in first, Kushner in second, SAR in third, Frisch is fourth, MTA is fifth. And then the remaining 4 teams, because there are 9 teams in each division, in case I didn't, that wasn't known before, but Ramaz is in sixth, Ori Sral is in seventh, Hillel is in eighth, and JEC is in ninth. So that right now is what we are looking at in terms of where these teams are in the current standings. And I'll get to the playoffs more towards the end of the video. It's, so definitely stick around for that. But just to talk a little bit about some of the expectations we've had coming in and to see how those divisions really do line up. So, we're talking, I'll go back to the East. So, I mentioned DRS is in first, and I feel like that was something that was pretty well expected, at least in the East. DRS was the runner-up in last year's varsity champion, not the runner-up, excuse me. Last year won the championship. I'll get to runner-up. I meant TAPC was there. But DRS, the champion from last year on the varsity level. Now, when this team was on the JV level 2 years ago, they were the runner-up. That's what I meant to say. That's what I was alluding to when I mentioned runner-up for DRS. So this exact same team on the varsity level lost in the championship when they were in JV, but they did win out the Eastern Conference when they were in the JV league. So I think it's pretty fair to have expected them to really stay at the top of the Eastern Conference. Now, then again, Hafter is behind them, and they're not separated by such a large margin, but for now, DRS is ahead of them. And I think it's fair to say that, that they should probably stay there. With that being said, you look at the teams right behind them, and I know a lot of you guys might be thinking, okay, well, like Hafter was a good, Hafter, it makes sense for them to be up there. Yeah, it does. They were a pretty solid team last year. They're still a pretty solid team this year. A lot of the pieces from last year's team remain. Last year's JV team had some very, very strong sophomores who have come up and really translated well to the varsity stage of things as juniors. North Shore is a team that might make some people scratch their head and say, North Shore, it's kind of surprising that they're up there. Yeah, I got news for you. 2 years ago, North Shore was a semifinal team in the JV level. They were the weakest, so to speak, of those four teams, them being an SAR, TABC, DRS, and North Shore. And North Shore was kind of the odd sheep out. They got blown out in their semifinal against TABC, and SAR and DRS had a hard, close battle that went down to the wire in the end. So, look, it is sort of like a list of tiers where you go, okay, like maybe the teams that are really at the top are here, and North Shore might be a little bit below them, but look, right now they're playing very well. I'm not going over all the records as I mentioned. I don't have time. We don't have time for that. But North Shore's been able to stay in there and they've won some games. I said, we'll talk about some of the past experiences. I guess if you just want me to give you a bit of a rundown for that, they've beaten YD, a team that's tough to play against. They've beaten Flatbush, a team that's tough to play against. They've beaten Ramaz, a team that has drastically improved. They've actually beaten YD twice. I apologize. I did mention that. And look, they still do have some interesting games coming up. They're going to have a game in DRS coming up. They're going to have a game at Hacker coming up, a game against Hank coming up. It's going to be interesting. So I definitely wouldn't expect them to just stay where they are. They're definitely going to experience some turbulence going forward. But to start their season, it's been pretty solid for them. I want to shout out Yosef Naor and Aaron Do have been doing a great job with that squad so far, leading them. I know we're still pretty early on into the season, but right now they're the third seed in the East, and I don't think a lot of people expected them to be there. So credit to them for that. And then you keep on looking, and I said North Shore being in third place. You've got YDE in fourth. They're always a team that's going to play hard, even if they're not necessarily going to make the playoffs. And you got Hank right behind them. Hank might be the biggest surprise for me right now, considering that they're in fifth. Then again, they still have not played the majority of their schedule, so the best is still yet to come from them. And they started off with a rough couple of games, not because they didn't play well in particular. It's really just who they had on their schedule. They opened their season against Mag and David and they blew them out 12-1. But then a game against DRS, who's arguably the best team in the league this year, a game against SAR at SAR. They're one of the best teams in the league this year. And it's sort of like, a win against Schechter, Solomon Schechter, a win against Rambam, a win against Flatbush. Okay, like, they've sort of started to build it up for themselves. But in terms of what they still have coming up, they're still going to play Hafter. That's going to be a tough game for them. They're still going to play DRS again. That's going to be a tough game for them. They're going to play TABC. That's going to be a tough game for them. And they're actually going to get Hafter a second time. Like right now, you're looking at it and saying, okay, Hank, they're in a fine spot. I still expect them to put it together. The question for me is going to be, I think the difference is can they take those games maybe from Hafter? Because this way you're only looking at another maybe loss or two, depending on what happens against DRS and against TABC. But I'll get there when I get to, when I talk about those other teams. In hindsight, when I get to those other teams that I haven't yet mentioned. So we're talking about that, and now if you want to go just a little bit farther beyond the five spot, you're looking at Flatbush, who's right behind Hank in the standings. They're like a game or two behind. They're going to play each other again on Monday on December 9th. So that's going to be an interesting one. You've got Rambam, who has been a little bit better this year than they were 2 years ago. And then you've got Solomon Schechter and Mag and David, who haven't won a game yet this year. It's just I think it's fair to say those two teams at the bottom in Schechter and Mag and David really will not be coming back. I mean, Mag and David blitzed their schedule very early on. We're looking at it and I'm saying, okay, I think that they might even be mathematically eliminated. If they're not mathematically eliminated, then they're going to be close to it. Solomon Schechter, on the other hand, has not been mathematically eliminated yet, but very similar to the way it has balled out with Mag and David. I mean, before December, similar to them, they played 6 games. And I know there are deadlines that teams need to play their games by, but they seem to have a few more in than others, at least by that point, because we could be seeing teams playing within that span. Right now it's early December, and before December, they had already put themselves in an 0-6 hole. So that's really just not something that benefited them. But the truth of the matter is that it is what it is right now. So that really kind of breaks it down. And then also, I didn't mention a little bit on Rambam. Rambam has been better than they were 2 years ago. It's interesting. They've been fighting against, against some of these teams. They've had some pretty interesting games. The game where they've been in it, the games where they've been in it, but not actually been able to pull away. An overtime loss to YDE in late November. The 5-0 loss to DRS. I know that was early on, but I think a lot more people expected that to be worse than it actually ended up being. The opening season win against Ori Yisrael at overtime at home. They've played some interesting games. It's going to be very interesting to see where they go going forward. I still would not expect them to make a big push and make the playoffs, but with a goalie like Rami Kesak and a goal scorer like Moshe Holzer, you really never know what could happen if they play their cards right. And we'll see what happens there. And then finally, Flatbush. Flatbush right now is just on the outside looking in terms of, you want to be in the top 5 spots of your division. And right now, I think there definitely could be some shifting around between YDE, Hank, Flatbush, maybe even North Shore, as I mentioned. I'm not really sure. It's going to depend on what happens over the next set of games. That'll take us on to the Western Conference. And in the Western Conference, so just to restate the order of teams in that division. So right now, TABC, Kushner, SAR, Frisch, MTA are 1 through 5 in that order. And then 6 through 9 are Ramaz, or Yisrael, Hillel, and JEC. It's very, very clear to me, at least, that TABC is the one and the only one in this Western Conference division. They are, they're undefeated, and it's not just that they're undefeated, it's also, the fact that they've played some of their tougher games already. They've already beaten Frisch, they've already beaten SAR, they've actually already beaten no, yeah, they've already beaten Frisch, they've already beaten SAR, and it's going to be interesting to see. Frisch and SAR are two of the better teams in the Western Conference and in the league as a whole. They have another game coming up against Frisch. They have another game coming up against MTA. Oh, Ramaz, sorry. Also, Ramaz, the most recent one. And that they've taken care of business, to say the least. Now, look, they still have another game against Kushner. They've still got another game against DRS. They've got not another game, but a game against DRS that they're going to play out. Another game against MTA, who's still very much in the playoff mix. They've got another game against SAR at SAR. They're going to play Hank. They're going to play Kushner again. It's going to be very interesting to see where they fall. I do believe they will be the 1 seed in the West when all is said and done at the end of the regular season and going into the playoffs. It'll be interesting. I think that the big factors for me are how they won't be the one in the West is if they drop another game to Frisch, another game, not another game to Frisch, if they drop the second game to Frisch, if they drop the game to DRS, if they drop the game to SAR, maybe even a game or two to Kushner, who knows? Again, I don't see that happening, but that's sort of what would do it if it were to happen. Moving on, we are going to talk about the next 2 teams, or actually the next 3 teams, comparatively speaking, and that is Kushner, SAR, and Frisch. SAR right now is right behind Kushner. Well, we'll start with Kushner, actually. Kushner has a bit of a deeper team this year than we've seen them have in years past. Now, that is because they have grades 9 through 12 on this team, but they're getting contributions from some players who are not, right at the top of the age class. And I'm not talking about necessarily talent-wise, but really more age-wise. The big 2 pieces that have really led this team on offense and defense are, of course, Kobe Eisenberg and James Orbach. In net, really want to give credit. Simon Rosenfeld seems like he's been absolutely locked down, in the games that he's needed to be. It's going to be interesting when they play TABC twice, but they've already beaten, not beaten. They've already played against, they've already played against Frisch. And I correct myself, I'm saying beaten because Frisch did sweep them, but one of those games being in overtime and the other one being a 3-1 game. I think a lot of people expected Frisch, if they were going to beat Kushner, to really beat Kushner. And they didn't. I don't know exactly how it happened in terms of who had the better of play, because scores don't always indicate that. But for only giving up a total of 5 goals in 2 games to that Frisch team, a team with a very high-powered offense, got to tip your cap. It couldn't all just be to the offense and defense. Obviously, your goaltender needs to contribute. So credit to Simon Rosenfeld there. He's been doing a great job as the backbone for that Kushner team so far. And look, they're in second place in the West. I don't think a lot of people expected them to be there at this point. Could it change? Of course. Will it change? I do think it will. However, they're in a good spot right now. I definitely would think that they would make the playoffs if I were going to put a prediction on it right now. Moving on, we're going to go to the SAR Sting. Right now, they're in third place. SAR, as I mentioned, should at least, or not should, but 2 years ago on the JV level was one of the top 4 teams in the league. They finished, if you were going to mark them down, I would put them at 3 because they didn't make the championship, but they were the better of the 2 teams that lost in the semis. That was them, and that was North Shore. And the great thing about this team is there's just such a good mix of 11th and 12th graders who all contribute at high levels. Obviously, everybody already knows about Sammy Glass. Everybody knows about Mo Jenner. Everyone knows about Ari Levine. Everybody already knows about Morty Namath. Everybody knows that Henry Wolf is a great player who's also playing ice hockey. But the reality is, and it could be there are way more of the guys playing ice hockey. I'm just saying those are like the immediate ones that come to mind. But first of all, huge transfer, and I don't not necessarily from school, but from ice to also floor. Bennett Brigida has been a huge piece for them. And then I mentioned the mix of 12th and 11th graders. In the 11th graders, you still have the guys who were last year's 10th grade champion, 9th and 10th grade champions, but the 10th graders who really were dominant as 9th graders as well. And those are guys like Eitan Adler, like Jack Linhart, like Nate Zitter, like Ellie Fenster. You've got Nathaniel Sadi on this team. He wasn't on the SAR JV team 2 years ago. He wasn't in SAR that year. You know, this is a very good team. And of course, Michael Goldman in net. I mentioned Bennett Brigida coming over from ice to play floor. Also, Jacob Rosenstein, who was on last year's JV team, is now on this year's varsity team. He didn't play 2 years ago. This SAR team, for me, definitely got better from 2 years ago, both on paper and in terms of the way I've seen them play. I saw their game against Hank. Great game. Hank played well, but SAR really just looks like they are on another level. And I do think they will jump Kushner eventually, who's in second place right now. If I had to put a prediction on it, I would say SAR can't end up any worse than the 2 seed in the West. But then again, that could all change. But they've really been able to play well. Their only blemish so far on the season is a loss to TABC. Happened a couple weeks ago in TABC. As I mentioned, they're going to play TABC going forward. And look, they do have an interesting schedule just in terms of what they have coming up. They've got 2 games against Frisch coming up. They've got a game against MTA still coming up, the game against TABC, 2 against Kushner, game against Ramaz. It's going to be interesting. Definitely going to be interesting to see where they go. But if I had to put a prediction on it, I'd say they probably end up in the 2 seed. Moving on, we'll talk Frisch now. Frisch, a team that has done, pretty solidly so far up until this point. They're always going to be a deep team and they're always going to be competitive. They've always proven that to be. And look, they played some great games so far. They've got the 2 wins against Kushner, one of them being in overtime. They did lose to TABC to begin their season, but then again, that's TABC. As I mentioned, I think they're one of the favorites, if not the favorite, to win this league, as they were the JV champions 2 years ago. The win against MTA, that's a team that's right behind them, and it was pretty convincing, 7-0. This is a team that I definitely expect to make the playoffs. I know I said I wasn't going to dive so far into the matchups and everything, but just, to give you guys some perspective on where these teams sort of stand and where I think they'll end up. That's what I think about Frisch. Rock solid team. Are they going to win the championship this year? I mean, I would probably say not if I had to put a bet on it, but you never know. You never know. They've got some players that you could really highlight. Obviously, Ellie Khan has been absolutely phenomenal for them, scoring left and right. Nathaniel Cohen's been great for them on the back end. Nathan Davidson's been great for them coming up from the JV level. Aton Fine and A.B. Fields are 2 absolute horses. And of course, you've got the bring up of Albie Hornblast, who was one of the leaders on last year's JV team that made the semis. Paxton Horace is a workhorse. You've got Akiva Rotenberg in net, who's an absolute brick wall. And an interesting addition of Elijah Zakai this year, who's been playing ice hockey for them, but certainly I would expect to contribute. And I know he has contributed on the varsity level. So definitely going to be very interesting to see where they go forward. And, as I said, it's a rock solid team all around. You can never go wrong with it. Will they be overmatched in some games coming up? I don't know. Only one way to find out. We're going to have to experience it. Moving on, we're going to group the next team. Well, actually, we'll put MTA in with those three, the 2 through 5 seeds. So MTA is in fifth right now, and this is a team that has sort of flip-flop coaches over the last few years. From Rabbi Stone, Joe Trop. If they were together now, it's Jakey Friedman. It's interesting. They're kind of going through the cycle where their team, I think, is good enough to at least compete and give themselves a chance to win, but there's no set system that these players have always been used to because every coach likes to do things a little bit different. So that's just the way it is. It's not a knock. I know Jakey Friedman well. He's a great hockey mind, one of the greatest goalies in Yeshiva League history, if not the greatest goalie in Yeshiva League history. If I'm not mistaken, Yitzi Kopstick is on the bench with him as well. Two great minds that come together. For me, it's really just about if I compare them to the 3 teams or the 4 teams that are ahead of them in the standings right now, do they match? And look, they've got some guys who have both been getting better over the last few years, as well as some proven guys. Israel Avraham is a guy who's really played himself into the top areas of the lineup, and he's done a great job. You've got guys like Alicia Gams, like Avriel Galler, who have been good depth pieces for them. Isaac Kantowitz helps lead them on the back end. Obviously, you've got the big scorer in Chaim Simon and his partner, Yoshua Ratzker. Where it is for me, and I know there are other names I'm leaving off this list. It's not intentional. We just, I'm trying to move this thing along here. It's where it is for me is what will they do against those top teams, the real top teams? Because right now they're 5-3. But if you go ahead and look at it, they're going to play TABC again. They're actually, they've only played Frisch once. And for me, they've got another game coming up against TABC, or sorry, they're going to play TABC. And they've got to play SAR again. And what are we gonna get from them against a team like Ramaz, who's a bit more unknown this year? It'll be very interesting to see what happens with them. My big question is, will they sustain sort of their positioning in the standings? And the answer to that is really just, I'm not sure. It's really wild cards once you get past a certain number of teams. If I had to put a prediction on it, I would say they will, but we'll see what happens. The last 4 teams in the West I'm going to go over. We'll talk about Ramaz, Or Yisrael, Hillel, JEC. I'll start from the bottom and go up again, just like we did for the last 4 teams in the East. So JEC right now, similar to Solomon Schechter and Magen David, is they really grouped a bunch of their games in the early stages of the season. They were 0-6. They are 0-7, but they were 0-6 before the month of December began. So with that being said, yes, it has not been great for them, but this is a team that has kind of stayed around the bottom of the league the last few years. And look, you look at this team's roster, and the most common thing you notice is that there are actually a lot of ninth and 10th graders on this team. So there's no need to, there's reason to believe or understand why they might not be as strong this year, but who knows, in another year or two, they could be a lot better if these guys continue to develop, get better, and who knows, but for now, it's interesting. It's interesting not that not that they were 0-6 coming into December and they're 0-7 very early December. It's just about the fact that, look, these guys are getting experience, and I would definitely not put the entirety of the season, in terms of blame on any particular player. Like, they're just not in a very comfortable situation. And it's tough, but they will get through it. Moving up a little bit, you've got right in front of JEC, Hillel. Hillel has a very interesting storyline because they have not been fantastic. As a whole, their record is not great. It kind of does speak for itself. They, before the month of November, they really were not in a good spot. They had 1 win, 6 losses, and an overtime loss. So whatever, 7 losses total. But I'm going based off of the point system here. And the reality is for them though that in a lot of these games, they're not really getting blown out. You look at Ramaz, who's a little bit ahead of them, and they only lost that game 2-0. You look at Or Yisrael, who's a little bit ahead of them. and they lost that game 7-3, going down to the wire, or Yisrael pulls ahead late. It's really just against, TABC and SAR, if you want to include Kushner, where they've been blown out of the water. That's really where it is for them. So, in terms of what they have coming up, they're going to play Solomon Schechter and JEC twice. Not Schechter twice, but Solomon Schechter. They're going to play JEC twice. They're going to play MTA, who did beat them, but closer game than most others. And really, their only other game they have left that should be such a challenge for them is Frisch. I mean, we'll throw MTA in there because right now they're in a playoff spot. But as I mentioned, Halo, this could get better for them. I know they're 1-6-1 right now. That means they can't go better than 7-6-1 in terms of their total record. But the reality is for them, or excuse me, if yeah, 1-6-1 as I mentioned. So, that means that they can't go better than 7-6-1. So we'll see what happens with them. But again, definitely going to be a bit more interesting than most other people think. Moving on, we'll go to Or Yisrael. Or Yisrael last year had a predominantly ninth through 11th grade team. So this year it's more of a 10th through 12th grade team. There is only one ninth grader on the team this year. They do have, and on top of that, it's also not such a deep team. But with that being said, I mean, they've, similar to Hillel, not really put the wins together so much. Before November, it hasn't been that great for them. They were 2-5-1, which isn't fantastic, but it's like you look at that, and with that being said, they are still in, or were in, a lot of those games that they lost. Losing to Ramaz 6-4, for example, losing to Rambam in overtime 5-4, losing to Hillel 7-4. These are games. These are games where it's like they've been losing to MTA 7-3, also similar to the Hillel Or Yisrael game where it was a tight game and then Or Yisrael pulled away late. It's going to be interesting to see. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. And with that being said, in terms of what they have coming up, just to preview a little again, they're going to play JEC. That's a winnable game for them. They're going to play YDE. That might be a winnable at Or Yisrael. That could very well be a winnable game for them. They're still going to play Frisch and MTA. Those are going to be two tougher games for them. But with that being said, I mean, there's no reason to say if this team manages to take it all going forward, they could put themselves right back in the playoff conversation, especially if they take points from a team like MTA, who's just ahead of them, also in the playoff race. A team like Frisch, who's who not even closer than MTA, but right around that same area. So we'll see what happens there. And finally, the last team to talk about in the West would be the Ramaz Rams. The Rams 2 years ago on the JV level started their season, and a game or two in forfeited the rest of their season. I don't know if it was a numbers issue or whatever it was, but at the end of the day, they just left the league in the middle of the year, and not in the middle really, like way more early on. But that's what happened. Now you fast forward 2 years. I don't know if people didn't expect them to have a good team or if people expected them to be more of a basement dweller, so to speak, but they have been a pretty pleasant surprise. If you were to ask me, just because, not because I would have assumed any of the options of them not being great or them, being in the basement, so to speak, of the league. It's really just, I don't know why they forfeited their season. And I think when a team forfeits the season, that's kind of what the expectations just immediately become because of the narratives that have happened, like in years past when that's happened. So, or when teams have dropped out of the league because they had a stretch of years where they weren't so competitive, if not even just competitive, if they were just straight up, not really good at all. But you look at it, and they started their season early with losses to Ramaz, not to Ramaz, to MTA and Flatbush. And both of those games were in Ramaz, which is understandable, okay? But look, they get the win over Or Yisrael. They have a competitive game with SAR, a competitive game with North Shore. They shut Hillel out. They beat JEC, in another competitive game, this time with TABC, arguably the best team in the league. You know, this is a very, very interesting team. They're still going to play Hillel again. I would expect them to probably take that game. And in terms of what they have coming up, they're going to play Kushner. That should make for an interesting game. They're going to play Frisch. That should make for an interesting game. They could beat JEC again. I think they could beat MTA in the right spot. Will they beat SAR? I'm not sure. Probably not. If I had to guess, they've already lost 4-0 to them. But then again, that game was in SAR. If that game in Ramaz, all they need is a bounce or two. Maybe they could turn that game around. Who knows? Ramaz has been a very interesting team going. They, in my opinion, were not such an interesting team as maybe. Let me rephrase that. They were more of an interesting team in my eyes than in the eyes of many coming into the year. But I think there was fair reasoning why, for other people, they didn't expect them to be, as interesting a team. But look, they've been able to hold their own so far for what their expectations were, and they could sneak into the playoffs. You never know. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens going forward from there. So that sort of is what we've seen so far, sort of the expectations the teams had coming into the season and some of the recent and past occurrences. Just some more of the notable, I would say the factors going down the road from here in terms of some big games to watch out for. Hafter's still going to play DRS in the East. That's actually going to happen. That's still going to happen twice, if I'm not mistaken, because of the fact that I think at the moment both teams are undefeated. Let me give it a look. Yeah, they both are undefeated. Hafter's going to play DRS twice, so that could really be the factor that separates the East top teams, from each other, whether it's Hafter DRS, if it's going to be Hank DRS, Hank Hafter, whoever. Hank's going to play Hafter twice. Hank is also going to play TABC and DRS once each. They've already played DRS once this year, but they're going to play DRS again, and they're going to play TABC. And I believe that the DRS game is going to be at DRS, while the TABC game is going to be at Hank. So that will be interesting for them. I already mentioned DRS. I know that was the first team that I broke down, but DRS still has a game against Hank and 2 games against Hafter, as well as a game against TABC and a game against Frisch. So a lot of notable games to look out over there. We'll talk real quickly just about what we also have in terms of SAR and TABC and Frisch remaining, because those, I think, are the 3 teams we could see potentially change in terms of what's coming up, because TABC is going to play Kushner. They're going to play DRS. They're going to play SAR again. They're going to play Kushner again. They're going to play Frisch one more time, if I'm not mistaken. And they're going to play Hank. These are going to be some good games for them, very good games for the league that I think really will do a lot in terms of breaking down and deciding where teams finish up in the standings. We're going to talk real quick about SAR in terms of what they have coming up, but it's a couple games against Frisch. We've got another notable game against MTA, another game against TABC that's going to be at SAR, a pair of games against Kushner, and one at Ramaz. Again, this SAR team, I know I said I would expect them to finish very high up in the standings, and who knows, maybe they can surprise people and make an appearance in the championship. But then again, everyone's got to work for it. Everyone's got to work for that spot. And we'll talk about Frisch also just a little bit, because I didn't go so far in on them in terms of what they have coming up. But we've got another couple games against SAR, a game at Ramaz that'll be interesting, a game against Hafter, and a game against DRS. Again, these are all going to be great games. These would be like the games that if I were to mark them down, I would not if I were to mark them down, I would say mark these games down, because they could play huge impacts going forward in the playoff race. Now, with that being said, to close out this episode, what we are going to do is we are going to break down the way the playoffs work. So I've already talked a little bit about, and if I hadn't hinted towards it or if I hadn't given it away, the way it works is that there are 2 divisions, 2 conferences, the East and the West. Each division or each conference has 9 teams in it. The way it works is as follows, because we haven't had this setup, at least, I don't know if it happened in the 2019-20 season that COVID shut down, but at the very least, I know for a fact that we had this layout in 2018-19. And the way it works is as follows. It's the same layout as that year. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in each division. So the 1 through 5 seeds make the playoffs. Here's where it gets interesting. 1, 2, and 3 in each division. The 1 seed, 2 seed, and 3 seed in each division all get byes. Stay with me. Then the 4 seed and the 5 seed in each division play the opposite 4 and 5 seeds cross conference. So, just to give you an example of how it would look right now. Right now, in the East, DRS, Hafter, and North Shore would be the 1, 2, and 3 seeds, so they would get buys. YDE would be the 4, and Hank would be the 5 in the East. And then in the West, TABC, Kushner, SAR would be 1, 2, 3 in that order. Frisch would be the 4, and MTA would be the 5. So what would happen is that TABC, Kushner, and SAR would get buys in the West, and DRS, Hafter, and North Shore would get buys in the East. And then the 4s and the 5s would cross. And the winners of those games would become the 4 wherever they win. So YDE would host Frisch. Not Frisch, excuse me. They would host MTA. So MTA would go to YDE because YDE is the 4 in the East and MTA is the 5 in the West. And then Frisch would host Hank because Hank is the 5 in the East and Frisch is the 4 in the West. Whichever team wins then becomes the 4 wherever they played. So in YDE's case, because they're the 4, if they were to beat MTA, they would stay the 4. And then if Frisch were to win, they would stay the 4. But if MTA were to beat YDE, MTA would become the 4 in the East. And if Hank were to beat Frisch at Frisch, Hank would become the 4 in the West. And then it goes to the bracket of what we had 2 years ago on the varsity level, where there were 8 teams that made it in, and it was just 1 versus 4 cross conference, 2 versus 3 cross conference, and it's a straight bracket. That's how the playoffs work. Again, I'm not saying the playoffs will finish with the teams I'm giving as the example in those exact spots. I don't believe that will be the case. I do believe there will be some teams that might get shaken up in the standings a bit, but that's just for reference, just for example. And if I really had to put any kind of prediction on what the standings will look like going forward, the only things I can really say I would be somewhat, I don't want to say certain about, but what I would lean mostly towards happening or believing I think would happen would be that DRS would probably stay atop of the East and TABC would probably stay atop of the West. I don't know. As I mentioned, there are some notable games, a lot of notable games for a bunch of teams that are going to be fighting it out to try to put themselves in the best possible position. Because if you're a playoff team this year, you want to be one of the 1, 2, or 3 seeds. And that could happen with a bunch of teams that I've already mentioned. These playoff seedings, and the standings right now can totally get shaken up. We've got a couple months still to see what happens. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. And as I always say, there's only one way for us to find out what happens, and that is to experience it. So I want to thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the Yeshiva League Pass Hockey Podcast. And again, I want to thank the Weiselberg Law Firm for sponsoring, reminding everybody once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely.